John and Susan's family life, which had recently been filled with passion, had been ruthlessly consumed by the demands of everyday life and the responsibilities of raising 3 children. Frankly speaking, the head of the family felt extremely disappointed and almost deceived, despite the fact that on the surface, everything looked different. It all started on a promising note. John, being 11 years older than his young wife, a rarity in today's world, he was her first man. Under his careful guidance, Susan blossomed as a woman. From that moment on, he stopped finding his former girlfriends charming. He began to look at them under a microscope, noticing flaws he'd never noticed before: cellulite, gray hairs, sloppily groomed bikini zones. For some reason, he was drawn to the innocent girl living in her imaginary world of pink ponies and princes. It wasn't hard for an alpha male like him to charm this naive beauty with her perfect body, because he knew all the tricks to please women. He knew when to be gentle and when to be assertive. With the right approach, he unlocked the door to her heart. However, he could hardly explain to himself what went wrong when he let his guard down. Exploring her young body too vigorously, he had forgotten that excessive pleasure could lead to bigger problems. John was used to his previous girlfriends taking care of themselves to avoid unwanted consequences in bed. Susan, on the other hand, had to be taught everything John knew. Then one day, the inevitable happened. As usual, he came to pick up his girlfriend from the university to bring her to his apartment. There was an air of anticipation inside him. Today, he wanted to show her some interesting techniques in the bedroom. However, he realized from the expression on Susan's face as she approached the car that something was wrong. Her cheeks had taken on a pale green hue, and her eyes were staring into the ground. A feeling of unease rose in John's chest. He was afraid that her mother had found out about their relationship and forbade her daughter from seeing him. According to Susan's stories, her mother was an extremely evil woman. However, the reality was even more horrific. Sitting in the front seat, Susan continued to unnerve John with her silence. He knew how to get her to give in, and barely touching her skin with his fingertips, drew a line from her knee to her sensitive area. Instead of a passionate kiss, however, she finally mustered up the courage to speak. "I think I might be pregnant. The girls bought a test for me at the drugstore, and I took it at recess." 2 stripes. John, as if at the same time, experienced the shock of the cold water and the attachment of the electrodes to his body. For a brief moment, he found it difficult to even breathe. This meant the end of everything. In any case, he was completely unprepared for such a situation. It was one thing to enjoy mutual pleasure, but it was quite another to start a family and raise children. Of course, he imagined he would get married someday, but not now. He was only 34 years old, and there was still so much uncharted territory ahead of him. At the moment, however, he needed to appease Susan. After all, he had played no small part in what had happened, and was just as much to blame. Sighing and gradually calming down, he spoke, "Let's not worry too much. Life will put everything in its proper place. Let's go to my place." At the apartment, they experienced again what they so desperately desired. For a while, they forgot about the pregnancy. The problem seemed to disappear by itself, but what followed was like a horrible movie. Susan's mother, Pamela, when she learned of her daughter's predicament, made a huge scandal. Amazingly, she managed to get John's mother involved without his knowledge. John's mother had always wanted her son to start a family and give her grandchildren. For months, both mothers pressed John relentlessly, demanding that he marry Susan. Eventually, he gave in to their demands. John couldn't help but sympathize with Susan. After all, no one forbade him from cheating once he was married. However, this was a delusion. The wedding took place, then their first son was born, followed a year later by their second son. To John's horror, 2 years later his wife unexpectedly became pregnant a 3rd time, despite his best efforts to prevent it. The two seemed incredibly compatible. By this point, the young family had taken out a loan to buy an apartment. John's parents contributed financially, and split the payments between them, thus helping the young family. John, who worked as a simple laborer and received a modest salary, could only dream of having his own place. John's life became a nightmare. Susan's once attractive and alluring body had turned into something not very beautiful. Her breasts sagged, and her belly was adorned with layers of fat. Cellulite covered not only her thighs, but her arms as well. She showed no desire to change her appearance. Giving up a prestigious university education, she completely immersed herself in the world of diapers and baby snot, proudly proclaiming herself a housewife. The age difference between them became irrelevant, as the wife seemed even older than her husband. John had no way out. To somehow relieve the stress caused by the constant cries of children, he had short affairs. One day, Susan came to the conclusion that in the city, their children are deprived of fresh air and necessary vitamins, and persuaded him to buy a modest country home. At first he was hesitant, but in time he realized that this decision would allow him to spend more free time with his girlfriends. The inexpensive lakeside cottage pleased his wife, and he realized the advantages it offered. That afternoon, Susan gathered all the children and took them out of town. John, on the other hand, had some unfinished business and planned to join the family later. He intended to have some privacy with his new girlfriend, since her husband was away at work, and she claimed she was bored and needed a vacation. However, barely had John finished showering and applying a fragrant perfume to his skin when the doorbell rang. Frowning, he quickly wrapped a towel around himself and hurried into the hallway. On the threshold stood his mother-in-law, holding a large package. Glancing at her son-in-law, the woman lowered her eyes in embarrassment and muttered, "Susan and I agreed that I would help you clean up the house while the children are away." "I hope I'm not intruding," said the mother-in-law. John found himself in an awkward situation. A sudden warmth swept over him, especially under the towel, and reminded him of the feelings he had once had for Susan. They hadn't yet been married then. Despite his best efforts with other women, he couldn't replicate the same pleasure. The awkward pause lasted what seemed like an eternity until Susan's mother saw something she wasn't supposed to see. She blushed, handed her bag to John, and tried to squeeze past him into the apartment. When he reached out to take the bag, his fingers made contact with his mother-in-law's fingers, which were as soft and cool to the touch as Susan's. As she closed the door behind her, she looked at her son-in-law with a mixture of tension and shyness. Despite her age, she had maintained a flawless figure through careful grooming. John thought he lost his mind for a moment. Standing before him was Susan with her familiar piercing blue eyes and full lips. In an instant, the towels and clothes of the guests fell to the floor. The phone on the nightstand made a low, high-pitched sound. It was a call from a friend John had forgotten about, a friend who was expecting a date. At that moment, however, John didn't hear the call. His mind was consumed with concrete thoughts and concerns. Hours later, Susan's mother finally released herself from John's embrace, and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. She spoke, and there was sadness and understanding in her words. "I know you don't love my daughter. Since you've had your children, she's completely changed. I've tried to talk to her many times to make her realize that her husband can't be forgotten. But I don't think she can hear me. You are an amazing person, and I never wanted your family to fall apart. So I'm proposing a kind of arrangement. Sometimes you and I will do secret stuff, and you will continue to be with Susan, at least while the kids are little. No one will ever know what goes on between us. We have a family bond." John was willing to do anything for this woman. Silently taking her hand, he kissed it gently and pulled her to him. He had never imagined that he would be able to feel such happiness and joy again. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law was diligently tidying up, dusting and scrubbing the floors. John went to the village, where his wife was waiting for him, displeased as usual. But this time, her displeasure did not bother or anger him. As he closed his eyes, he mentally pictured his mother-in-law again and again.